Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
Mm-hmm. And we want Interdependent Study to be a space we're always learning with one another,
Hey.
which we've been doing for 100 episodes.
That's right.
And Damien, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today on our 100th episode?
I'm so excited. This is wild. 100 episodes.
I know.
Good on us.
Only took us a couple years and a little bit.
That's right. Well, happy 100th episode to you, my friend. For our 100th episode, I have brought a book to the table for us to talk about. The book is called As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Liberation. And it was written by Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson and features a really great foreword that was written by Miriam Kaba. The book actually was published back in 2018 by our friends over in AK Press, but I think it gained some additional popularity in and around 2020, given sort of the context of that year. And, this was a great book, right? And it's totally a worthwhile read. If folks haven't heard about it or checked it out yet, I would definitely encourage you to do so. I think at its core, this book is all about the notion of resistance and what resistance has looked like throughout the history of this country, especially for Black people, and especially in response to things like white supremacy and racism and violence and oppression and the prison industrial complex and so on and so forth, right? And so the book really explores what kinds of radical resistance we actually need in order to transform our conditions and actually achieve liberation for all people. Again, this book was great. I thought there was a tremendous amount of profound wisdom in it. And so I think there's a lot that we can talk about today. So here we are in episode 100. I'm excited that we got to read this book and for our conversation today. So where do you want to start? What did you think?
Yeah. So, I wanted to revisit, not revisit, but talk about 100 episodes real quick. It feels overwhelming to be at this point, to be honest. Like we've done this 100 times.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So one thing I just want to, I guess, share is that we recently crested 5,000 total plays of this podcast, which, if you do some quick math, that's about 50 per episode, which is really cool.
Yes.
So thanks to all of you all for listening, for joining us on this journey as we continue to try to learn and unlearn stuff.
I love
together.
it. Yes,
so yeah,
thank you.
Back to the book. Such a good read, and it got into the ways that I think Blackness has had to be grounded in anarchism, right? And by that, we don't mean chaos as right. Things are typically described as anarchy when there's seemingly a lack of organization to stuff, but we mean specifically the actual political philosophy that is about creating cooperative communities and sort of avoiding unnecessary hierarchy or the coercion that comes with that hierarchy.
Yes.
And so that kind of cooperation has been necessary for the survival in the face of oppression, as you mentioned, specifically in the U.S., but around the globe as well. And it's because the U.S. specifically has enforced a very strict racial hierarchy on Black folks.
Yes.
I think this book, does a lot to critique that, but does so much to critique the intersecting systems of oppression and control that influence all of our day-to-day lives in different ways, from capitalism to patriarchy to all kinds of other aspects of those overarching systems as well. So this was a really great holistic look at how all of these things kind of intersect with one another.
That's such a great point. It's such a great way to describe it, like this holistic look at what's going on, right? And I'm so glad you brought up that point about sort of, their argument that Blackness needs to be centered in anarchism, right? And so I really did appreciate their holistic look at sort of how these systems of oppression and all the isms that we know of and that exist in the world, and the state, right? The state's role in all of this, right? And in Black people's lives and Indigenous people's lives and really all of our lives. So I think they did such a great job providing us that context. One of the most direct and poignant statements that they made actually in the first chapter of this book that I highlighted and I had to just sort of sit with, and so I wanted to share it. It was this quote: "The Black American condition today is an evolved condition directly connected to the history of slavery, and that will continue to be the case as long as the United States remains an ongoing settler project. Nothing short of a complete dismantling of the American state as it presently exists can or will disrupt this."
Yeah.
Right? And I think that reality is fact, and that fact is reality, right? The book is so good because for me, they don't hold back any punches. Throughout the book, they don't hold back any punches in presenting sort of our history and the reality of our conditions of our society and what that truly means for Black people or folks with oppressed identities. And I think we need more of that. We need to not dance around the topic or whatever it might be, right? Like this book was just an unflinching look at the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and it took it at a big picture level, and walk through some of that history. And I love the sort of intersection that they take too with anti-Blackness and settler colonialism as well. I think is a really important sort of intersecting analysis where you bring those things together to understand the totality of the impact of that. Absolutely. So one of the concepts in the book that was relatively new to me, but I think an important lens that we can use when looking at the way our society and culture in the U.S. has been organized is necropolitics, which they define as, quote, "the capacity of the state to dictate who lives and who dies, who is understood as having a right or claim to life, and who is relegated to inhumanity and social death." They specifically talk about it in the context of Blackness and how every space inhabited by Black people is a space in which Black life is relegated to die. And so they go in to talk about this more in the context of gentrification and the violence that is present in that process. And I want to, reflect on how much of this is connected to our violent colonial and enslaving history in the U.S. and how we relegate all kinds of people who are deemed marginal to their own spaces outside of the acceptable settler, white, middle, and upper class, cisgender, and heterosexual centers of power. There's this undercurrent of, you're not welcome here, go back to the space we let you have. And then when that space is desirable, those systems of power take it back. And it's happened over and over and over again to people who the U.S. has decided can be thrown away. And so I'm grateful to have this new, to me, term, necropolitics, to describe this ongoing process of sort of disposal and then reclamation of the space that they have, that has been thrown to them as a bone, of like a crumb of something to use to survive on.
Yeah. Wow. I'm really glad you brought that up. I think one of the things that I've always appreciated you talk about here on this podcast, and we talk about it outside of this too, is just this idea of, you've always been connected to this idea of disposability, right? And the ways in which that has shown up throughout our history. And it always gets me, because it is a real reality of our society, right? And a real reality of these systems and the state, right? And just our reality. And so to have, I think this term really connects all of that together, as you talk about. And it's such an important concept and reality to recognize about our country, right? And the reality of our situation. And the connection there to gentrification was really great. I'm glad that they went that route for sure.
I mean, because if you think about it, it's sort of repeated systems of like colonization.
Yes.
Where we are, relegating people to marginal places and then saying, "Oh no, we actually need that space back.
We want that space back."
That's kind of what it's always been in this country.
Yeah, right. So in different shades of that color, right? Absolutely. Yeah. So I appreciate that. I appreciate so much of the connections there. And what they presented in the book, to sort of what I talked about earlier. And I think all of it's connected to why Black liberation and collective liberation is so critical to transforming our society, right? Like, so there's another quote that I pulled out that I think connects to this. They say this, quote, "Black liberation poses an existential threat to white supremacy because the existence of free Black people necessitates a complete transformation and destruction of this settler state. The United States cannot exist without Black subjection, and in this way, articulated racial formations revolve in large part around anti-Black regulations. It is impossible to reform the system of racial capitalism. Those who believe in and operate according to the laws of white supremacy are not solely white people, though beneficiaries are largely and mostly visibly white. The supporters of this system include an internally oppressed multiracial coalition," right? And I think there's a great connection in there in that quote, what you just talked about, and again to what you've talked about before around this idea of disposability, this notion of disposability in this country. So I think all of that, for me, is a really compelling reason and rationale for why we do this work, why we believe in things like abolition, right?
Yeah.
And certainly collective liberation for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love that quote. I almost brought it myself.
Hey, great minds.
So another moment in this book that I think connects back to our conversation about Maurice Mitchell's article, Building Resilient Organizations.
Any more opportunity to talk about that? Yeah, please.
Yeah. And how our organizations fall into the traps that are set for it by the very conditions we're working against. And then we, replicate those conditions because of the traps. They say, quote, "Building a new and innovative left should be a primary concern. But it is important to remain free from the constraints of left sectarian dogma, cults of personality, and selfish jostling to be recognized as, quote, movement leaders. We can organize humbly and horizontally and resist the stratification of more easily destructible movements past. And we do not need leaders in any classical sense." And this speaks so much to how easy it is to repeat hierarchies that we've all experienced. We fall into the same patterns of control and submission that we see around us. And they're hard to resist because we don't have many models that have created new ways of being and working and organizing together that are all that well known. So we repeat what we see when we're organizing together against these conditions.
Yes, and these systems, right? I love that. I love the connection back to our friend Maurice Mitchell's work, but also there's a lot of connection there to this idea of, we don't know what we don't know, and all we know is what we know, right? And so unless we're able to find our new North Star, right?
Yep.
Dream of something better and different, it will always be what it is, unfortunately, right? And that's not acceptable, right? And that's not what we want.
Yep.
So I love that. I love that quote. Thanks for that. All right. Well, I think we have only scratched the surface of all the things that are in this incredible book.
Definitely.
But let's shift our conversation over to application here in this 100th episode of ours, and talk about how we're going to apply what we've learned from this book and talked about today in our daily lives. I mentioned this at the start of this episode, but I just think there's so much wisdom in this book. And Miriam Kaba actually talked about this in the foreword, but all of the wisdom in this book really reminds me of and centers around this idea that we have to recognize that we're all we've got, right?
Yeah.
And as we think about all of the forces of hate and oppression that exist in the world that we are actively fighting against, white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, sexism, transphobia, xenophobia, fascism, violence in all of its forms, really, this idea that we're all we've got is such a powerful notion. It's a North Star, right? Like we talked about last week with the Freedom Papers by our friends at the Dream Defenders. So to me, the idea that we're all that we've got is the application from this book, and what I want to keep at the forefront of the work that we're doing, at the forefront of the why of the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated her thinking there and her talking about that in the forward of this book.
Yeah, I love that. That axiom or that right, like we're all we've got, and we think about things differently when you think about it that way.
Oh, absolutely, right?
Yeah. My application for this week is a quote from page 17.
Okay.
At least 17 in the ebook. So if you're on paperback, I don't know.
Good luck.
Our ideas of what freedom and liberation mean to us must rest on something sturdier than the shoulders of charismatic and seemingly progressive politicians. We must define those for ourselves. We should not wait for the magic words we want to hear come out of someone else's mouth when we can designate, dictate, and deliver change ourselves. We should not sit back and wait for politicians to grant us our humanity that has always existed, and it should not be left to elections, political terms, or waiting periods to determine whether or not we will see it actualized.
That's good. That's really good.
Yeah. We have to collectively build power within our communities through coalitions and collaborations. So much of what was important to me in our discussion about the article between Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Jerica Purnell, and Olufemi Taiwo was how we need to have political homes.
Yes.
We need to find places where we can contribute to movement. I think it's bleak out there. It feels bleak out there. And my hope lies in all of us finding ways to contribute to our collective liberation.
Yes.
We all have skills that can contribute to movement. And Miriam Kaba recently tweeted some about how we all have skills, even if you don't think you do. There are skills that you have. We all have to connect them into political homes to turn us toward collective liberation beyond what's considered progressive today, because what's considered progressive is so flexible.
Yeah.
So if we're not defining those values for ourselves collectively of what that liberation looks like, what it is that we need as people, and what progressive looks like is actually based on what is normal in your society, right?
Yeah.
So we have to think about it in those terms too, where if the terms are dictated elsewhere, we then play to those terms. And so we have to dictate the terms collectively.
Absolutely. I love that. I also really am drawn to what you talked about around, like, we all have skills that can contribute to movement works, because I think, and I was literally just at a happy hour talking about this, like, sometimes everything feels too daunting, and sometimes folks don't always know, aren't able to be at the forefront of whatever organizing work is happening. They're not the ones who are able to go door to door, knock on doors, and do that kind of work, but they can be in their homes writing letters or writing postcards or doing sort of more, behind the scenes work. And so we all can play a role. We all have skills that can contribute. I think that's such an important piece of this, especially like if you're listening and you don't know how to get involved or where to get involved. It doesn't necessarily have to be you're on sort of the front lines doing the organizing. There are plenty of people with those skills to do that. And so you have to sort of, get in where you fit in, right? And use your skills to contribute. So I love that. I look at you connecting this book to all of the great things we've been reading recently and talking about recently. You got a gold star for today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, let's move on to homework. What ideas do we have for what we want to do?
Excuse me, I've already gotten my gold star. I don't have to do homework today.
I don't think that's how this works.
Oh no.
I cannot. For me, I really can't overstate how much I enjoyed this book, how much I learned from it. And so I want to learn more from both of the authors of this book. So my homework is to do just that. William C. Anderson has actually written another book called The Notion of No Map. One more time. The Nation on No Map, which looks really good. And so I'd love to read that and add that to our list. And Zoe Samudzi has written pieces for Vice and The New Inquiry that I would like to check out as well. So I'm just going to add some things to our long reading list.
Yeah, me too.
How about you?
Yeah. So this book references a book called Against the Fascist Creep by Alexander Reed Ross, which is about the conditions and ideologies that allow fascism to creep into society. So I'm going to add that to our very long reading list because it seems super relevant for us to discuss.
Relevant, yes.
It was also written back in 2017, published back in 2017. So specifically, it's in the context of the then very recent election of Donald Trump.
Yes.
And since then, there's been so much more kind of fascist creep as we consider all these things that are happening in states all over.
States
all over the country.
Absolutely. What a great book to add to our list. I love it. Very good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here we are wrapping up episode 100.
Sure are.
Aaron, my friend, you're up next week. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing a couple of articles about Stop Cop City, which is a movement against a planned police training facility that would basically be a recreation of a city for tactical military-esque police training.
Yeah.
Urban warfare for the police, an urban warfare playground for the police to play in that would cost millions of dollars, and also in Atlanta specifically tear down some forest there. So there's environmental impacts too. The first article is from the Bitter Southerner called The Forest for the Trees. And another is from Prism, and that's called The Fight to Stop Cop City Has Decades-Old Roots. And so these massive training facilities have big environmental impacts, as I mentioned, and also continue to pour millions of dollars into police departments that continue to enact violence on the citizens of their cities.
Yeah.
So, the discussion right now is about Atlanta. That's where the movement for this is right now. That's where that home is. But there are similar proposals in other cities across the country. One I heard about recently is Pittsburgh, that would be more expensive, larger, and have a different kind of impact than the one in Atlanta. So that's what we're talking about next week.
I'm looking forward to that. I think this has really gained some, momentum and traction here recently on social media, and sort of, the work folks are doing to try to amplify this, the Stop Cop City movement. And so I want to learn more about it. My initial thought, not knowing anything really, is just this idea of millions of dollars being poured into this kind of action, this thing, is not what we need.
No.
At all. So thanks for finding it and for bringing it to the table for us next time. With that, we want to thank you all for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study for the 100th time. We so appreciate you. You know what we want you to do, but in case you've forgotten, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on the socials, check us out on YouTube, and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening 100 times. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.